talk about this mosaic of the Emperor Justinian, and I want to talk about it as an example of medieval art.
Well, one of the issues I think that's most pressing when you look at a reproduction of this mosaic is that it's so out of context, because this mosaic is embedded in the wall, it's embedded in the church, it's embedded in its historical moment.
Right, and the thing is that on everyone's computer monitor, students always say, you know, the background looks green, or why is the emperor wearing brown?
It would look very different in person.
This is
gorgeous.
Gold. It's mostly
gorgeous.
Gold.
But it's more than that. It's these little tiles of glass that are set at slightly different angles so that the oil lanterns and the candles and the sunlight, it all makes this surface just flicker and appear and disappear.
Right.
It's beautiful.
Right, and it's in this church with mosaics all over the walls, with capitals on columns that are carved, with beautiful vaulted ceilings and light coming in through the window. And it's a very spiritual environment. It's very different from looking at this on your computer monitor.
So we need to be careful and just remember that we're looking at this really ripped out of its context.
We're also looking at it about 8 inches wide or 6 inches wide when it takes up a whole wall. And in fact, this mosaic is on a wall, on one side of a wall on where the altar is in this church. So it flanks the altar.
And in fact, Justinian, the emperor in the middle, is actually facing off with his wife, Theodora.
Right. His
on the
wife is
opposite wall.
on the mosaic on the opposite wall. And so...
Actually, you know, it's just important to remember that the photographer had a kind of privileged view when he took this photograph, looking straight across. But in fact, in reality, we would be looking up. And there's a kind
and it would look kind of skewed.
But not only that, there's a kind of reverence, I think, because we'd be looking up at these sort of heavenly figures.
That's true. That's a good point. So what I really want to focus on are, I think, the sort of two big questions that we ask when we look at a work of art. One having to do with how the artist treats the human body, and the other how the artist treats space, what human beings exist in.
In both cases here, they're so abstracted.
They're so abstracted, meaning, what do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is that there seems to be this profound rejection of all of the lessons that had been learned in the classical era before this. And so I think that, you know, probably we should spend a moment just thinking about why a work of art would be done like this. I mean, this is being done for the emperor, and so presumably the best artists could have been brought together to put this mosaic together, and yet it in no way lives up to the standards as we understood them during the classical era.
And those standards being treating space and the human body in a very realistic manner. And so when you say abstracted, you mean removed from reality.
That's right. And so these figures almost seem as if they're symbols in some way. And in fact, this is, of course, a mosaic that's chock full of symbolism.
Right. So let's just start by focusing on the bodies.
Okay.
So in ancient Greek and Roman sculpture, we would have these idealized bodies. We'd be able to see the muscles and the bones.
The figures
and
would be in
form of the body. The figures would look, they could move. They would look like they had human thought and movement. So let's take these figures and just think about the body. Can we even see the body?
No, the body seems almost rejected. It's completely hidden behind this sort of these
kind of walls of drapery.
That's right.
Walls of fabric,
which fall almost with no relationship to the bodies underneath.
Right.
them.
Can you see the knees, hips?
No,
very difficult.
There's no interest in that, or virtually none.
Right. So we have no interest in the actual anatomical structure of the body.
And as you mentioned a moment ago, this mosaic is also stripped of its location. There's no sense of these figures existing in space.
Right. There's no landscape background. There's no architecture for them to exist in. They seem to exist in a
frontal kind of almost frieze-like plane. Right.
They're all lined up in the same position. They're all facing front. Their faces all look very similar.
So this is the key question, is why would the artists of this early medieval period so profoundly, so completely reject the naturalism of the early classical world?
Well, that's the key question, right? Is it because they couldn't do it? It's sort of tempting to say, well, look at them. They didn't know how to do drapery anymore. Look at the feet. They're all kind of funky and standing on each other. And look at their faces. They all look the same.
But there must have been so many examples of classical art.
And how come their bodies are too long? And, you know.
There must have been so many examples of classical art that were still available. when we're in the 6th century. And so the ability seems to me not to be an adequate answer. I think this must have been a conscious rejection.
Absolutely. So if the figures are not in reality and they're not realistic looking, obviously the artist is distancing these figures from our everyday physical world.
The here and now.
The here and now, and placing them in a world, I think, that is meant to be transcendent and spiritual and above our earthly physical
you certainly
lives,
see that.
where people, there's life and death and growth. They're located in a world where there is no time, there is no beginning and end.
I think that
they're in an eternal location.
That idea is supported very directly by the broad use of gold, that sort of reflected light that's meant to symbolize the light of heaven that surrounds them. It's supported by this idea of the attenuation or elongation of the bodies.
Right. So if you look, and just try to trace with your finger from their ankles all the way up to their hips, it's an incredibly long.
They would be great
space.
Basketball players,
yes,
wouldn't they?
Yes, they would be oddly proportioned.
So here we have artists that are no longer interested in representing these figures according to the proportions and the careful study of the anatomy of the body that we saw in the classical period, in order to create a figure that is, in a sense, timeless, that is heavenly, and that is not of this world, not of the here and now, not of the flesh and blood, but of the spiritual plane.
Right, and therefore, as you said before, what the artist is doing is creating symbols instead of sort of real figures. So the emperor becomes a symbol, and that happens because he's right in the middle. He's dressed in gold, differently from the other figures. He has a halo, which indicates a circle around his head, which indicates his divinity, his divine status. He has a crown on his head and jewels, and so he is, this sort of symbol of authority and power. And on either side of him are members of the clergy, who we can identify also by what they wear and what they carry. And we also have another symbol, which is that the emperor is the most important person, but there's also a person who's almost as important as the emperor.
Who's named, actually, isn't he? If you look just above his head, you can actually see letters.
Right. His name is Maximianus, or Maximian, and he wears gold.
And he was the archbishop of this church.
Right. So the artist is telling us, the emperor is the most important. This archbishop is also important. The emperor is supported by the clergy, and the emperor is also supported by an army. He's the head of the military, he's the head of the church, and so we see this sort of group of 5 or 6 soldiers on the left that sort of symbolizes the power of the military behind the Emperor Justinian.
So what we're really seeing here then is a very symbolic kind of representation of the legitimacy, in a sense, of Justinian's rule. We have Justinian almost as a kind of Christ-like figure, almost a mirror of Christ with his own halo. He's surrounded by the clergy to our right, on the right side, his left. His ministers immediately next to him, and then the army, in a sense, the 3 branches of government, all represented here.
Right, and that sense, again, that they're in some spiritual heavenly realm is also emphasized by the weightlessness of the figures. If you look down at their feet, they sort of dangle down, and there's no sense of an earthly ground.
The feet are very funny, actually. If you take a look at what the emperor almost seems to be stepping on the toes of one of his ministers.
Right, and I think that's a symbol of telling us that the emperor is more important than his ministers.
His foot is in front, and that's what's key.
Front.
He's not really stepping on the toe.
Although there's a little bit of ambiguity, too. If you look at the emperor and Maximian, if you look at the top of them, it looks like the emperor's in front, but if you look down at their legs, it looks like the Archbishop Maximian is in front. And I like the feet of the soldiers in the army, because there's only like 6 feet or 5 feet, but 6 heads. So the number of feet don't match the head. So this is clearly just a symbolic world.
But clearly not necessary. This is not meant to be read literally. It's meant to be read symbolically. It's almost meant to be read as language, in a sense. And
maybe we should talk then, right, and why language? Because the people at the time were illiterate and would have to have learned about who was the authority. They would have learned the stories of the Bible. They would have learned about power by looking at these images in the church. It's likely that Justinian would never have actually visited Ravenna, and so this is then, I guess, a way of him really asserting his power in this distant church.